Hey guys, this is Nitin from FTC Team 18172, Uplift Robotics, and in this video, I'll be going over the sketch tools within Creo. The sketches that I make in this video are part of the drivetrain that I started to create in the skeleton video, so I recommend that you check that video out after this one. Alright, so let's get right into sketches in Creo. Sketches are 2D geometry that are created using different commands combined together to create any 2D shape. These sketches provide the basis for most of the features in Creo, as they define the shape that will be produced. In order to create a sketch, you can go to the sketch command under the datums group. So within the command there's a few different options, but the only requirement is to create a sketch using a surface or a datum plane, and I've gone ahead and created some datum planes. But there's a few other options that'll help in defining the orientation of my sketch. So in order to select a datum plane, you can either select it from the graphics window or from the model tree. So I'll select mine from the model tree. I know I want the outer drive trait plane as my first sketch, so I'll select that. So once I do that, you need to select a reference, which will help in defining the orientation of your sketch. So I'll go ahead and select the plane that I want, which is the front plane. And now once I do that, the sketch view orientation and direction are now allowed. So for the sketch view direction, you can either select the flip button or you can use the arrow from the graphics window. So I'll use the graphics window one and flip the orientation or the direction. For the orientation though, I'm going to select the right orientation because I know that's the orientation that I want. So now that I finished all those, I can hit sketch. If you ever want to access those commands once you've created a sketch, you can go to the top left corner and hit the sketch setup command. So now that I'm in my sketch, I want to reorient my screen in order to face the sketch so that I can get a more accurate view. So I can do that by going to this command in the toolbar, the sketch view command, and reorient the screen to face that sketch. Alright, within sketch mode, there's a lot of commands, but I'll take you through some of the more complex ones, since the circles and rectangles are fairly self-explanatory. If you notice, some of the tools have drop-down menus for multiple ways to define that sketch, which can be useful in certain circumstances. To start, I'll create a center rectangle and use the drop-down menu. So I want a center rectangle. I'll click on it, and now I'll drag it over to the origin, and now I can use that and drag it out, and I can place it wherever I want. So I'm just going to place it right there. And if I hit my middle mouse button, now my sketch is defined. So within the rectangle, there's a few different blue dimensions that pop up, and these are called weak dimensions, which are essentially dimensions that don't have a value assigned to them. So it's best practice to make sure that you have no weak dimensions and only strong dimensions, which are dimensions with actual defined values. So in order to create a strong dimension, I'm simply going to double click on the dimension that I want to change. So I want to change this dimension to be 432 millimeters. And now you'll see that my rectangle has shifted. And for the other dimension, I want this to be 70 millimeters. For most sketches, you should probably include more features within them, but for my skeleton, I'm going to keep them separated so it's easier for me to edit them. Alright, so now I'll create another sketch using the same datum plane and the same orientation. So I'll just quickly change those. Alright, so now that I'm in the sketch, I want to use the outer edges of the drivetrain plate in order to determine the position of my wheels. In order to do that, there are references, which take the existing geometry from components and use them in my sketch. So in order to create a reference, you can hold down your right mouse button and select the reference, or you can use the command from the top left corner. So now that I'll select down the command, and it'll pull up this window. So in this window, all you have to do is click on the reference that you want to use. So I want to use my rectangle, right? So I'll get the entire rectangle and hit solve, which will fully place the rectangle into my new sketch. Now for my wheels, I don't want to create the wheels themselves as a sketch line because this might interfere with my other sketches. So instead, I'm going to use construction mode, which creates references that can be used for my sketch. Once I click on it, you'll notice that some of my commands that I used for my sketch tools will still be available. So I can use a construction circle, and I can set it along this area. So I actually want to set it along the middle line, so I can use the references tab once again to get this datum plane as a center line. Hit solve, close out of that, and now I can use this for my construction circle. So now I'll create my construction circle, and that looks good. So I'll hit middle mouse button, and now you'll notice that it creates a couple of weak dimensions. So this radius dimension right here for the circle, I don't actually want the radius, I want the diameter. So in order to change this dimension type, I'm going to use the dimension command right here. So I'll click on the dimension command, go to the circle, double click on the circle, and then use the middle mouse button, and now you'll notice that it changes the dimension type from radius to diameter. And now I can enter the diameter of my wheel. The dimension command essentially allows you to change the dimension type based on the references that you give it. You can also create reference dimensions right underneath the dimension command that are dependent upon another entity, so they can't actually be changed. Next, I'm going to change this weak dimension right here, but instead of using the dimension command, I'm going to use the constraints. There are many types of constraints, such as horizontal, vertical, perpendicular, parallel, and there's a few others that you can learn about as you progress through Creo. I want my wheel circle to be constrained to the outer edge of the drivetrain plate. So I'm going to use the tangent constraint in order to do this. So using the tangent constraint, I'm going to select my circle and then the outer edge of the drivetrain plate. And now you notice that my wheel sketch has been shifted over. Next, I'll uncheck the construction mode and I'll use a concentric circle in order to create a hole for the bearing. So that looks good right there. Middle mouse button, and then I'll change the dimension right here to be 14. That looks good. Next, I'll use some editing tools in order to get the second wheel on the other side of my sketch. But first, I need a center line, so I can use that command right here, and I can make a center line along the middle of my drive plate. Now I can select my entire sketch and mirror it over the center line. So now that I've selected my entire sketch by dragging over, I can use the mirror command and hit the center line, and now you'll notice that it's been mirrored over. So that'll be good for my wheel sketch, and now I'll close out. Now I'm going to make the standoff sketch, so I'm going to open up a new sketch and use the same planes that I used in the previous sketches, and I'll change it to the orientation that I had it as before. Now I'll hit sketch. I'm also going to use the same references that I used in the last sketch. Click solve on those. And now for my standoffs, I'm going to use the circle tool in order to create a circle right about here. And I'll change the diameter to 4. And then for these other weak dimensions, I'm going to use the dimension tool and set a fixed distance away from the outer edges of the drivetrain. So I want this distance to be 5 millimeters. So I'm going to do this for both edges. And I'll set that also equal to 5. So I can use the equal constraint now in order to make these dimensions the same. In order to get the standoff hole on each of the corners of the plate, I can either mirror it along center lines or pattern the hole. But for this, I find it easier to mirror the center lines, or mirror it along center lines. So I'm going to mirror it twice but first I'm going to create some center lines. Create some center lines real quick. And now I'll just drag over it, and then use the mirror tool. Mirror over the first center line, drag over the other two, now mirrored over that line, and now you notice that I have my 4 standoffs in the corners. So I'll click OK. If you ever needed dimensions that relied upon each other by some number, then you can also use relations within the sketch as well. So I recommend that you check out our video on relations. Alright, now I want my sketches to be used for the other plate, so I'm going to go ahead and make a new sketch, but this time use the inner drive plate and use the same references but just flipped. Now I'll sketch, and now I'll reorient my screen as well. So in this sketch, I want the edges of the outer drive plate bearing and the standoff holes from the previous sketches. So what I can do is use the project tool. So this is going to take the geometry and the sketches from those other sketches and bring them to this new sketch. So I can go ahead and use the project tool, and I'm going to click on the features that I want. One last feature that I'll mention is the palette. So within a sketch, I'll just take a random sketch. Within the sketch, there's the palette, which you can use predefined shapes and even create your own shapes and use that as a predefined sketch. So in order to set your palette, you have to use a config.pro option. So that's how I got this go build a pattern. You'll notice that there's some other shapes such as polygon stars and some profile shapes. But in order to set it in your config.pro options, I'll click out of my sketch. You can go to File, Options, Configuration Editor, and here I have a 2D palette path configuration. And for the value, I set a directory to where I have an SEC or a .dxf file saved. And this is the file that it will be used as the template for the sketch. So in order for the palette to use the sketch that you created, it has to be either a .sec file or the .dxf file. But you can always create multiple directories where you have your palette stored. As always, the Creo files made in this video will be published in our GitHub repository in the description. If you have any questions about sketching, Creo, or FTC in general, feel free to contact our team through our social media information in the description. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more tutorials in CAD, FTC, and more coming soon.